The snow was already 3 feet deep when the letter arrived, and Garrett Voss read it twice, certain he'd misunderstood. He hadn't. The HOA wanted his snowblower. Permanently. And when he looked out his window at the idling plow truck in his driveway, something quiet and final clicked into place behind his eyes. Garrett Voss had lived on Birchwood Lane for 11 years, which was long enough to remember when the neighborhood was something worth living in. Back then, Birchwood Lane was the kind of street where people left their garage doors open on summer afternoons and waved at each other without calculating the social cost of the gesture. Back then, the HOA was a loose arrangement of neighbors who met twice a year in someone's living room, drank bad coffee, and agreed to keep their lawns trimmed and their holiday lights down by February. Back then, there was no Renata Sahlberg. Renata had moved in 4 years ago, buying the large colonial at the top of the cul-de-sac with her husband, Derek, who traveled for work so constantly that most residents had never actually met him. She had arrived with professionally printed moving announcements, actual announcements, slipped into every mailbox on the street, and within 6 months she had run for HOA president unopposed, because nobody else wanted the job badly enough to fight her for it. Garrett had watched the transformation with the detached curiosity of a man who had too much going on in his own life to engage. He ran a small excavation company, just him and 2 employees, and he owned the only commercial-grade plow truck in a 40-mile radius that wasn't contracted to the county. In winter, he made serious money clearing private driveways, small parking lots, and business entrances. The work was hard, the hours were brutal when storms hit, and he had built the business from nothing after his divorce 6 years ago. It was his life's honest work, and he was proud of it. He also owned a Husqvarna 2-stage snowblower, the wide-deck commercial model, the kind that could eat through 18 inches of packed snow without straining. He'd bought it for his own driveway but often used it to clear the sidewalk in front of his neighbors' homes when he had a few extra minutes on a Sunday morning. It was a neighborly thing he did without announcement or expectation. He didn't post about it. He didn't mention it. He just did it. Renata noticed. Renata noticed everything. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in mid-January, during the second serious winter storm of the season. Garrett had been out since 4 in the morning, running plow routes. He came home at 11, exhausted, tracking ice melt across his entryway floor, and found the HOA envelope sitting on his kitchen counter where he'd dropped the mail without looking at it. He made coffee first, sat down, opened it. The letter was 3 pages long, typed in Times New Roman, printed on HOA letterhead that Renata had apparently had professionally designed. It cited Section 4.7 of the Community Covenants, a section Garrett had never read, had never had reason to read, which, Renata had interpreted, allowed the HOA to requisition community resources in the interest of neighborhood safety and shared welfare during declared weather emergencies. It then informed Garrett that his snowblower was being designated a shared community resource, effective immediately, to be stored in the HOA's rented unit at the storage facility on Route 9, and made available to residents on a scheduled rotation overseen by the HOA board. There was a line at the bottom asking him to confirm receipt and arrange a time for the equipment to be collected. Garrett read it again, slowly. Then he set the letter on the table and drank his coffee. He was not a man who made quick decisions. His father had taught him that. His father had been a contractor, a man who measured twice and cut once, and who had told Garrett as a teenager that the most dangerous moment in any disagreement was the first 30 seconds, when your blood was up and your mouth was faster than your judgment. Garrett finished the coffee, he refilled the mug, he sat for another 10 minutes. Then he called Marcus Webb, the only attorney he knew personally, who handled contracts for small businesses and had once helped Garrett navigate a payment dispute with a commercial client. Marcus answered on the second ring, already sounding like he'd been awake for hours. "I need 5 minutes," Garrett said. "HOA issue." Homeowner associations, Marcus said, with the tone of a man who had heard this phrase too many times. Tell me. Garrett read the relevant portions of the letter aloud. There was a long pause on Marcus's end. They're citing a covenant requisition clause. That's what it says. Does the covenant actually say that? I have no idea. I never read the full document. Get me the governing documents. I'll look at it tonight. Marcus called back the following morning. The clause exists, he said. It's poorly written, which is typical. It was probably put in decades ago to cover situations like shared maintenance equipment or emergency generators. It has never, to any reasonable legal interpretation, been used to claim private property. But here's the problem. It's ambiguous enough that if she pushes it and you refuse without legal standing, she could take you to HOA arbitration, which is a pain regardless of outcome. Can she actually win? Probably not, but it'll cost you time and money either way. What do you want to do? Garrett thought about it. Nothing yet. I want to talk to her first. He drove to the Colonial at the top of the cul-de-sac the next afternoon. The driveway had been freshly plowed by whom, Garrett wasn't sure, since Renata had never hired him, and the front walk was salted. He rang the bell and waited. Renata answered in a cream turtleneck and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, carrying a tablet with the aggressive efficiency of someone who wanted you to know they were very busy. Garrett, she said, her voice warm and entirely without guilt, come in. I'd rather talk out here, he said. It won't take long. Her expression shifted by a fraction. Of course. He held up the letter. This isn't going to happen. She tilted her head, the gesture of a woman who had practiced patience as a social weapon. I understand it might seem like a significant ask, but the board reviewed the covenant language carefully, and we believe. Marcus Webb reviewed the covenant language, Garrett said. He believes differently. A small pause. You've already spoken to an attorney. I have, and I want to be very clear with you, neighbor to neighbor, because I think that should count for something. This snowblower was purchased with my money, stored on my property, and used voluntarily on my own time for the benefit of this neighborhood. The moment you try to take it, that voluntary arrangement ends, and I won't be clearing sidewalks anymore. Renata's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. The board's concern is equity. Not every resident has the means to clear their own walkways. We want to ensure. Then the board should buy a snowblower, Garrett said. There's nothing stopping you. The HOA budget. I know what you're going to say. The budget is tight. It's always tight. That's a budget problem, not my problem. I'm not a community resource. He left before she could respond. For 3 days, nothing happened. Then the letter came again, this time certified mail, more formal in tone, citing a deadline of 10 business days for Garrett to comply or face HOA arbitration proceedings. It was copied to all 6 members of the HOA board. Garrett read it, set it next to the first letter, and began making some very quiet decisions. The first decision was to call his cousin, Nolan, who lived in Delridge, a small town 60 miles north. Nolan worked in commercial real estate and had mentioned, the previous summer, that there was a small house on a half-acre lot near the edge of town that had been sitting unsold for 2 years. The price was low because it needed a roof, and the county road out front was unpaved but plowed by the municipality. Garrett called Nolan on a Thursday night. Is that property still available? He asked. The Hartwell Road place. Yeah, the owner dropped the price again last month. Why? I want to look at it. Garrett, it needs a new roof, new windows, and the kitchen is a disaster. I know. When can I see it? He drove up on a Saturday. The house was a modest 2-story farmhouse on the eastern edge of Delridge, surrounded by mature maples and set back far enough from the road that you had genuine privacy. The lot was flat and wide, with a gravel drive and a detached two-car garage that was actually in better shape than the house. The roof was bad but not catastrophic. The windows were old. The kitchen was, as advertised, a disaster. Garrett walked through every room slowly. He stood in the backyard for a long time, looking at the open space, thinking about where he'd park the truck and how the snowblower would fit in the garage. He drove back to Birchwood Lane that afternoon and called his realtor. The second decision was to say nothing to anyone on the street. He went about his days normally. He waved to neighbors. He got his mail. He ran his routes. He did not clear any sidewalks. When his neighbor Phil Andress asked casually if the snowblower was broken, Garrett said only that he'd been busy and let the conversation end there. Phil was a decent man, one of the few on the street Garrett genuinely liked. Phil was 62, retired, and had always minded his own business, which on Birchwood Lane had become an increasingly rare quality. Garrett felt something quiet and uncomfortable about not telling Phil what was coming, but he also knew that anything he said would eventually reach Renata, because it always did. Birchwood Lane was that kind of street now. The third decision was to accept the arbitration. He called Marcus. "Tell them I'll go to arbitration. Don't suggest any settlement, just agree to the process." "You want to go to arbitration?" Marcus sounded surprised. "I want this documented. I want it on record that she tried to take my property and what her reasoning was. And I want the process to take exactly as long as it's supposed to take." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "How long are you planning to be on Birchwood Lane?" "Long enough to close on a property I'm under contract for." Another pause. "Okay, I'll file the response." The arbitration was scheduled for mid-February. In the meantime, Garrett made an offer on the Hartwell Road property, which was accepted within 48 hours. He hired a contractor friend to assess the roof, got a quote he could live with, and arranged financing through a small regional bank that had handled his business accounts for years. The deal moved faster than he expected. The seller was motivated. The title was clean. The inspection turned up the issues they already knew about and nothing worse. He signed the purchase agreement on a Wednesday afternoon, sitting in a lawyer's office in Delridge, and drove home to Birchwood Lane in the dark, through a light snow that was already beginning to coat the roads. The street was quiet. The houses glowed from inside. Renata's Colonial sat at the top of the cul-de-sac with its porch lights blazing, as it always did, like a small monument to itself. Garrett parked in his driveway, looked at the truck, looked at the snowblower visible through the garage window, and went inside to make dinner. He didn't tell anyone, not yet. The arbitration meeting was held in a conference room at a title company's office near the highway, a neutral space, fluorescently lit, with a folding table and chairs that had seen better decades. The HOA sent Renata and two board members, a man named Todd Pfeffer who sold insurance, and a woman named Carla Engel who had joined the board the previous spring. Marcus sat next to Garrett. The arbitrator, a retired civil attorney named Henry Blum, presided with the weary efficiency of someone who had seen too many neighbor disputes to be surprised by anything. Renata had prepared. She had printed copies of the covenant document, highlighted and tabbed, along with a written statement from the board and a photograph of the snowblower taken from public property, which Garrett found almost impressively aggressive. Marcus had prepared more. He submitted the purchase receipt for the snowblower. He submitted Garrett's property tax records, demonstrating clear title to all equipment stored on the property. He submitted a 2-page legal opinion on the covenant clause, citing 3 prior HOA arbitration cases in the state in which similar requisition language had been ruled inapplicable to personally owned equipment. He also submitted a notarized account from Phil Andress. Garrett had not asked for this. Marcus had reached out independently, stating that the snowblower had always been understood by residents as Garrett's private property, used voluntarily and without compensation. Henry Blum read everything. He asked a handful of clarifying questions. He then recessed the meeting for 20 minutes and returned with a written summary ruling. The HOA's claim was denied. The covenant clause did not apply to privately owned equipment. The HOA was advised to seek alternative solutions to its snow removal needs. Renata was informed that any further attempts to requisition Garrett's property would constitute harassment under the state's property rights statutes. Renata accepted the ruling with the composure of a woman who had already decided it wasn't over. Garrett accepted it with the composure of a man who already had a closing date. He shook Henry Blum's hand. He nodded to Marcus. He walked out into the cold parking lot and stood next to his truck, looking at the gray February sky. The closing was in 19 days. He drove home, went into his garage, and began making a list of everything he needed to pack. The preparations were methodical, the way Garrett preferred everything to be. He didn't announce anything. He didn't post anything on the Birchwood Lane neighborhood app, which Renata moderated with the vigilance of a border-crossing official. He simply began, quietly, steadily, dismantling his life on that street in a way that looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. The first Saturday after the arbitration, he rented a storage unit in Delridge, a 10 by 20-foot climate-controlled space near the Route 7 interchange. Over the course of 3 weekends, driving early and returning late, he moved the things he didn't need daily. The spare equipment from the garage, his father's tools, the filing cabinets from his home office, the seasonal items from the basement. He did it in his personal truck, not the Plow truck, and he did it while the neighborhood was still asleep. The Plow truck stayed in the driveway as it always had. The snowblower sat in the garage, visible through the small window beside the garage door. To a casual observer, or to a neighbor glancing from a porch, nothing had changed. He called his 2 employees, Danny Reyes and Carl Friesen, and had a real conversation with both of them. Danny was 27, single, and had moved to the area for the work after washing out of a construction apprenticeship in the city. Carl was 41, divorced, with 2 kids he saw on alternating weekends. Both of them were good workers. Both of them had been with Garrett for more than 3 years. He told them he was relocating the business to Delridge. Danny's first question was practical. How far is that from here? About 60 miles north. A pause. I'd have to move. I know, I'm not asking you to decide right now. I wanted to tell you early so you have time. Carl's first question was also practical and said more about him. What happens to our routes down here? I'll honor all existing contracts through the end of the season. After that, I'll let clients know I'm not renewing. Or if either of you wants to start your own operation and take the contracts over, I'll help you do that. Carl was quiet for a moment. You'd walk away from that business. It took me years to build, Garrett said. It can take someone else years to build it bigger. I'm not precious about it. In the end, Danny said he'd think about moving north. Carl, whose kids were in school locally, said he'd likely stay, but wanted to talk more about taking over the routes. Garrett told him they'd work it out. He also called his 3 largest commercial clients, the strip mall on Foundry Road, the dental group off Route 12, and the church parking lot on Wheeler Street, and gave them 60 days advance notice, which was more than his contracts required. He gave each of them referrals to 2 other operators in the region he trusted. He did not explain his reasons for leaving. He said only that he was relocating and wanted to give them time to find a replacement. All 3 thanked him. The church administrator asked if he was okay. He said he was fine, thank you, and meant it. He closed on the Hartwell Road property on a cold Thursday afternoon in Delridge, signing the papers in the same small law office where he'd signed the purchase agreement. The roof contractor was already scheduled to start the following Monday. The window company had a 2-week lead time. The kitchen would have to wait until spring, which suited Garrett fine. He'd grown up eating at a folding table and had no strong feelings about countertops. That night, he sat in the house on Hartwell Road for the first time as its owner. He sat in an empty room on a folding chair he'd brought from the truck, eating a sandwich he'd bought from a gas station near the highway, listening to the silence. The maples outside moved in a light wind. The nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile down the road. There were no lights visible from any window except the cold blue wash of winter sky. It was exactly what he needed. He drove back to Birchwood Lane at 9 o'clock that night because he still lived there technically until the end of February. He still had his lease. The house on Birchwood Lane was a rental which had simplified certain things considerably. His lease was month to month, and he had given his landlord, Tom Feeney, a quiet heads-up 2 weeks prior. Tom, who lived in Florida and had never particularly liked the HOA, had simply said, "I understand and I appreciate the notice. Good luck." Garrett pulled into his driveway, and as he got out of the truck, the front door of the adjacent house opened and Phil Andress came out in a heavy coat, hands in his pockets, moving with the deliberate slowness of a man who had been watching for him. "Got a minute?" Phil asked. They stood in the driveway. Phil looked at the truck, then at the garage, then back at Garrett with the expression of a man who had added things up. "You're leaving," Phil said. Garrett didn't insult him by pretending otherwise. "End of the month." Phil nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment, because of the snowblower thing. "That was the last thing," Garrett said. "Not the only thing. She's been running this street like it's her private project for 3 years, Phil said. "Since the Kowalski family moved out and the Ramirez's. You know, she reported the Ramirez's basketball hoop to the county. An actual municipal complaint because the pole was 6 inches over the property line." Garrett hadn't known that specifically, but it didn't surprise him. "I'm 62 years old," Phil continued. "I own my home. I've been here 20 years. I can't just pick up and leave." He said it without bitterness, but the weight of it sat there between them in the cold air. "I know," Garrett said. "Are you going to tell people before you go?" Garrett considered it. "I think they'll figure it out when the truck is gone and the driveway is empty." Phil looked at the Plow truck again. He looked at it the way people look at things they haven't realized they've been counting on until the moment they understand it's leaving. "There's going to be 3 more storms before spring," Phil said quietly. "Probably," Garrett agreed. Phil nodded again, the way men nod when there's nothing left to say that would change anything. He went back inside. Garrett stood in the driveway alone for another minute, looking at the dark shape of the cul-de-sac, the porch lights of Renata's Colonial burning at the far end of it. Then he went inside and kept packing. The following week, Renata called an emergency HOA meeting regarding what she described in the neighborhood app as winter maintenance service gaps and community resource planning. Garrett read the notification on his phone and did not attend. He was in Delridge, meeting with the roof contractor and a plumber who had found a corroded pipe in the basement that needed replacement before the temperature dropped further. He heard about the meeting from Phil the next day. Phil texted, which was unusual for him. "She told people the HOA is looking into contracting a plowing service. Said she was going to negotiate a group rate for the neighborhood. Todd Pfeffer said his brother-in-law runs a landscaping company that does winter work. Nobody mentioned you." Garrett read the text, then he typed back how'd it go otherwise. She also said the snowblower issue was resolved in the HOA's favor. Garrett stared at that for a moment. He typed, "That's not what the arbitration ruling said." "I know, I was there." He put the phone in his pocket and went back to looking at the corroded pipe. The last week of February arrived with another storm, a serious one, the kind the local news spent 3 days building up, and that delivered almost exactly what it promised. 22 inches over 36 hours, with wind enough to drift. The county roads were cleared within 24 hours. Private driveways and neighborhood streets were another matter. Garrett had already moved most of his furniture. The house on Birchwood Lane echoed when he walked through it. His bed was an air mattress. His kitchen had 3 pots, a pan, and a coffee maker. He had given Tom Feeney formal written notice and had a final walkthrough scheduled for the 1st of March. During the storm, he ran his commercial routes one last time. It was the 3rd week of February, which meant his contracts were still active, and he honored them. He plowed the strip mall and the dental office and the church lot through the night and into the gray dawn, working alone because Danny and Carl were handling residential routes and had their own hands full. He did not plow Birchwood Lane. He had never had a contract for Birchwood Lane. The neighborhood had always relied on the county for the street itself and on residents, and on Garrett's voluntary effort with the snowblower for driveways and sidewalks. He thought about this as he drove back through town in the early morning, the plow raised, the truck lumbering through streets that were cleared but still white at the edges. He thought about Phil's driveway, which Phil would have to shovel himself, at 62, with a back that had been problematic since a fall 3 years ago. He thought about the elderly woman 3 houses down from Phil whose name he didn't know but whose driveway he had cleared a dozen times without being asked. He thought about the family with the 3 kids who had moved in last spring and whose father worked night shifts and whose wife had once knocked on his door to say thank you in a way that had clearly been difficult for her, as though accepting kindness cost something. He thought about Renata, at the top of the cul-de-sac, waiting for Todd Pfeffer's brother-in-law's landscaping company to show up. He drove home and parked the truck in the driveway of his nearly empty house. The snowblower was in the garage. He had not moved it yet. He sat in the truck for a while. The heater ticked as it cooled. The street outside was buried and silent, nothing moving in the white early morning except a single crow walking along the top of a buried fence post as though it owned the place. He thought about what kind of man he was, not what kind of man Renata assumed he was, or what kind of man the HOA had tried to reduce him to, a community resource, an asset to be managed. He thought about what he actually was when he stripped away the anger and the insult and the bone-deep satisfaction of leaving on his own terms. He was, at his core, a man who cleared driveways because people needed them cleared. That was the whole of it. He got out of the truck, he opened the garage, he pulled on his gloves. He cleared Phil's driveway first, then the elderly woman's, then the family with the 3 kids. He worked methodically, the Husqvarna's wide deck throwing arcs of white into the gray morning air, and he did not hurry because hurrying produced sloppy edges and Garrett had never done sloppy work in his life. He did not clear Renata's driveway. He did not clear the driveways of Todd Pfeffer or Carla Engel or the 2 other board members who had signed the requisition letter. He was precise about this. When he finished, he rolled the snowblower back into the garage and stood for a moment looking at it. Then he made a decision he hadn't fully known he was going to make until the moment he made it. He walked across the driveway and knocked on Phil's door. Phil answered in a bathrobe, surprised. When he saw Garrett on the step, he looked past him at the clean driveway, then back at Garrett. "I'd like you to have the snowblower," Garrett said, "when I leave, if you want it." Phil looked at him for a long moment. "That's a $1,500 machine." "I have another one in storage in Delridge." He didn't. He had a smaller single-stage model he'd bought for the new property, but he could make that true by the time spring was over. Phil was quiet, then he said, "She won't be able to take it from me. I own my house." "That's what I was thinking," Garrett said. Phil nodded slowly. His eyes were doing something complicated that neither of them acknowledged. "I'll have coffee ready when you're done loading the truck," Phil said, "if you want it." Garrett said he'd take him up on that. He went back inside and kept packing. 3 days. He had 3 days left on Birchwood Lane, and he intended to use all of them. The morning of March 1st was clear and cold, the kind of cold that arrives after storms have spent themselves, and the sky has wrung itself clean. The sun came through hard at a low winter angle, hitting the snow on every surface and making the street look briefly beautiful, which struck Garrett as ironic in the specific, pointed way that life sometimes produced irony without being asked. He was loading the last of it into the truck by 8 o'clock. The air mattress, the coffee maker, the 3 pots. He did the walkthrough with Tom Feeney's property manager, a quiet young man named Ethan who moved through the empty rooms with a clipboard and made only one note about a small scuff on the hallway baseboard that Garrett had already photographed, and that predated his tenancy. He handed over the keys at 9:15. He stood on the front step for a moment, looking down the length of Birchwood Lane. The cul-de-sac at the far end was still churned up white from the storm, drifted against the curbs and piled around the mailboxes. He could see that Renata's driveway had been partially cleared. Someone had done maybe a third of it with a manual shovel and given up, leaving a rough trench from the garage to the street. Todd Pfeffer's brother-in-law's company had apparently not yet materialized. Garrett looked at the Plow truck sitting in the driveway for the last time. Then he walked across to Phil's house and knocked. Phil answered in actual clothes this time. He had coffee ready. They sat in Phil's kitchen, a warm, lived-in kitchen that smelled like coffee and old wood, and drank it in the unhurried way of 2 men who had said what needed saying and weren't going to perform anything for each other's benefit. "Where is it exactly?" Phil asked. "Delridge." Garrett told him. Phil pulled out his phone and looked it up the way older men do, with the phone held at arm's length and his glasses on. "Nice country up there," Phil said. "Quieter," Garrett said. "That's not a small thing." "No," Garrett agreed, "it's not." They finished the coffee. Garrett stood and shook Phil's hand, which felt insufficient, but Phil gripped it with both hands the way Phil's generation gripped things, with their whole meaning behind it, and that made it sufficient. The snowblower was already in Phil's garage. Garrett had moved it the previous night after dark, which was how he preferred to do things that mattered. He walked out to the truck. He started the engine. He sat for a moment with the heat running and his hands on the wheel, looking at the street through the windshield. Then he pulled out of the driveway for the last time, drove to the end of Birchwood Lane, turned right, and did not look in the mirror. He was on the highway by 9:45. By noon, he was pulling into the gravel drive of the house on Hartwell Road, the maples bare above him, the open lot stretched out on either side, the detached garage waiting with its wide door, the new roof already done and the windows scheduled for the following week. He got out of the truck. The air here was colder and cleaner, the way northern air always is, carrying a quality that isn't quite silence but is adjacent to it, the feeling of space between things, the sensation of not being crowded. He opened the garage and drove the Plow truck inside. He stood for a moment in the dim space, smelling sawdust and cold concrete. Through the small window at the back of the garage, he could see the tree line at the edge of the property, the bare maples standing in their winter patience, waiting for something that was already on its way. He thought about the storm that was forecast for the following week. His first storm as a Delridge resident. His first set of roots up here, already contracted, 3 commercial properties and 2 residential driveways. Clients he'd found through a contact of Nolan's, modest to start, the way all businesses start when they're honest about themselves. He'd build it again, he knew how. He locked the garage and went inside to make coffee in an empty kitchen, and found, standing in front of the window with the sun coming through it at the low winter angle, that he felt something he hadn't felt on Birchwood Lane in a long time. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The 3rd storm of March came down hard on Birchwood Lane. Not the polite kind of winter storm that drops 8 inches and retreats by morning, but the stubborn, grinding kind that parks itself over a region for 2 full days and leaves 26 inches of dense, wet snow that tests the threshold of every snow removal device people think they own until they actually need it. Renata Sahlberg stood at her kitchen window on the morning of the second day and looked at the driveway that her husband Derek had, to his credit, attempted to clear the previous afternoon with a metal snow shovel he'd found in the garage corner where it had always been stored and never used. He had cleared 18 feet of it before his back, announced that it had opinions about this activity, and he had come inside and taken 2 ibuprofen and sat at the kitchen table in a way that communicated without words that the rest of the driveway was not going to happen. Renata looked at the driveway. Then she looked at her phone, where Todd Pfeffer had sent a message in the HOA group chat at 6:45 in the morning saying that his brother-in-law's company was at capacity and wouldn't be available until Saturday, which was 4 days away. She typed back, "Saturday is unacceptable." Todd replied with a thumbs-up emoji, which she found enraging. The HOA group chat was, at this point, 11 days into a slow-building tension that nobody had named directly, but that everyone on the street felt the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. The tension had begun on the morning of March 1st, when residents had emerged from their houses after the previous snowfall and found, in Phil Andress's words in the chat, simply, "Has anyone noticed Garrett's truck is gone?" The responses to this had been varied. Some people asked clarifying questions. Some people expressed surprise. Carla Engel posted something optimistic about the HOA's ongoing efforts to secure community snow removal services, which received no replies. Todd Pfeffer mentioned his brother-in-law. Nobody mentioned the snowblower directly, but the snowblower's absence from Garrett's garage, visible as an absence, the way absence always makes itself visible eventually, was noted in the private conversations that the group chat didn't capture. The elderly woman, whose name was Ruth McLean and who had been on Birchwood Lane for 31 years, told her daughter on the phone that the young man with the truck had moved away and that she wasn't sure who was going to clear her walk now. Phil Andress, who had spent 2 days working through feelings he couldn't entirely name, finally did name one of them on the morning of March 3rd, when Ruth McLean's walk was the first thing he cleared with the Husqvarna Garrett had left him. He did not clear Renata's walk. He had thought about it. He had genuinely considered it, because he was not a man who enjoyed withholding things. But he had thought about Ruth McLean's driveway and the family with the 3 kids on the other end of the street, and he had thought about what a person does with a $1,500 machine they've been given on the understanding that some things are worth being precise about. He was precise. Inside the Sahlberg Colonial, Renata had moved from the window to her desk, where she was composing an email to the HOA's attorney, not Marcus Webb, but a different attorney, one she'd consulted privately about the arbitration outcome and who had suggested, delicately, that she had perhaps overreached. She was composing a draft of what she wanted to say, which was that the neighborhood had been better served when it had a community snow removal resource, and that the loss of that resource was a direct consequence of the arbitration ruling, and that someone needed to address this. She read it back and understood, clearly and without self-deception, that what she'd written was a document describing the consequences of her own actions. She didn't send it. She called the HOA board meeting instead. It convened on a Thursday evening via video, everyone square on a grid of small windows, and Renata presented the problem with her usual brisk efficiency. The neighborhood lacked reliable snow removal, the contracted service was unavailable during storms, and the HOA needed a plan. "We need to buy a snowblower," said a board member named Susan Park, who had joined the board the previous fall and who had said nothing during the requisition proceedings because she hadn't understood what was happening until it was over. Something commercial grade, like what Garrett had. A silence. "The budget," Renata began. "The budget is the budget because we didn't want to spend money on things we assumed we could get for free," Susan said. She said it without heat, which made it land harder than heat would have. Another silence. "How much does a commercial-grade snowblower cost?" Todd Pfeffer asked. $1,500 to $2,200, Susan said. She had looked it up before the call. There's a Husqvarna model that would cover the entry walks on the whole street. Do we have that in the discretionary fund? Carla Angel asked. We have 1,200, Renata said. So we assess, Susan said. A one-time assessment for snow removal equipment, split 26 ways, that's $46 per household. People will pay $46. Renata sat very still behind her camera. Renata, Susan said, not unkindly, we have to do something. Ruth McLean is 78 years old. The Pattersons have 3 kids and 1 car. Phil can't clear the whole street by himself, and he shouldn't have to. Phil's clearing the street, Todd asked. With the machine Garrett left him, Susan said. Yes. Phil is doing what the HOA couldn't figure out how to do, with equipment that used to be available to all of us until we turned it into a legal dispute. The meeting concluded with a vote. The assessment was approved 4-1. Renata abstained. The purchase was made the following week. A Husqvarna 2